When I was a kid in the 90s, Chuck E. Cheese was the go-to spot for birthday parties, pizza, and games. Even with a giant rat for a mascot, Chuck E. Cheese raked in the dough back in the day. No pun intended. So what happened to every kid's favorite pizza place/arcade? Hey there, Intellectual Digest here. Today, we're going to take the toppings off and get to the crust of the story behind Chuck E. Cheese. Keep it here. Our story starts in 1977 in San Jose, California. Atari creator and founder Nolan Bushnell created Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater in order to expand the newly popular video game arcades past adults-only locations, like pool halls and bars, to more family-friendly venues. Bushnell had experience in the amusement and theme park industry and was a huge fan of Disneyland's Country Bear Jamboree. Bushnell then had the brilliant idea to combine games, food, and animatronics into one idea. The result was the very first Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater. When asked about his idea to combine the entertainment and restaurant industries, Bushnell had this to say: "It was my pet project. I chose pizza because of the wait time and the build schedule, very few components, and not too many ways to screw it up. Oh, if only it were that easy." Bushnell wanted to copy Walt Disney in another way by having a mascot, a character that families and kids could easily associate with the new arcade and restaurant. When the animatronics were first being designed and assembled, Bushnell realized that the costume he had purchased for his main character, what he thought was a coyote, was actually a rat, which, of course, caused Bushnell to change the name from his original name, Coyote Pizza, to Rick Rat's Pizza. Bushnell's marketing team believed that associating a rat with a pizza place would be unappetizing, so someone on the team proposed the name Chuck E. Cheese instead. Finally, the official name of the business became Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater. The rat's name was changed to Chuck, and the rest is history. Bushnell believed that in the late 1970s in America, there was something seriously lacking when it came to restaurants and theming, especially for the whole family. He even told Fast Company, "I wanted to add a dimension of fun to the act of having a meal." So Bushnell added what he knew best, video games, and got ready for the grand opening. When the first Chuck E. Cheese opened in San Jose in 1977, the concept was a huge hit. Chuck E. Cheese could easily fit up to 400 customers, which was more than any other pizzeria in the area. Plus, the 20-minute wait time for pizza was a goldmine, since it gave customers plenty of time to enjoy the arcade games. Chuck E. Cheese lured in customers, specifically kids, with free tokens that could be exchanged for prizes. It also helped that there were a whopping 75 games to choose from. However, in 1978, Bushnell's corporate parent company, Warner Communications, outright refused to open more locations. In response, Bushnell officially purchased the rights to characters and the concept of Chuck E. Cheese from Warner for $500,000, which was a lot of money back then. Then, Bushnell's partner at Atari, Gene Landrum, resigned from Atari to become Chuck E. Cheese's president and chief operating officer. By 1979, there were 7 more Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater locations, all in California. It was time to expand. By the summer of 1979, Bushnell and Landrum decided that it was time to expand their business beyond California and the West Coast. Bushnell agreed to franchise, which ultimately resulted in a partnership between Bushnell and Chuck E. Cheese and Robert Brock of Topeka Inn Management. This agreement gave Brock the exclusive franchising rights to open Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time Theaters in 16 more states across the southern and midwestern United States. Brock also formed a subdivision, which he called Pizza Showbiz, in order to develop and expand the Chuck E. Cheese brand even further. Later in 1979, Brock was introduced to Aaron Fechter of Creative Engineering Incorporated and his extensive work and expertise in animatronics. In November of that year, Brock visited Creative Engineering Incorporated and came to the conclusion that the competition between Creative Engineering's animatronics and Bushnell's current, Brock-designed animatronics at those first few Chuck E. Cheese locations would be too strong, or rather, too animated. It was then that Brock requested to be released from his contract with Bushnell, wishing that Bushnell would work with Fechter and Creative Engineering instead. Just in time for the holiday season in 1979, Brock and Fechter came together to form Showbiz Pizza Place Incorporated. Showbiz Pizza Place was identical to Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater in every way except for those animatronics, which were new and improved. Thanks to Fechter and his team at Creative Engineering, on March 3, 1980, the first Showbiz Pizza Place Incorporated opened its doors in Kansas City, Missouri. This is where the problems started. Not long after that first Showbiz Pizza Place opened, Bushnell actually sued Brock and Topeka in management due to breach of contract. Naturally, Brock issued a countersuit against Bushnell, citing misrepresentation. The court case began the same month as the grand opening of Showbiz Pizza Place Incorporated, and eventually, the two parties agreed to settle out of court. Showbiz Pizza ultimately agreed to pay Pizza Time Theater a portion of their profits over the next decade. Also during this difficult time, Topeka Inn management changed its name to Brock Hotel Corporation and moved their headquarters to Irving, Texas. Wow! Did you have any idea that the pizza arcade animatronics business was so cutthroat? Have you ever been to a Showbiz Pizza Place? This is actually the first time I've ever heard of Showbiz Pizza Place. I'd love to get your thoughts in the comments section. With all the court drama and finger-pointing, both Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza Place experienced a significant increase in business and revenue as the video game industry exploded in the 1980s. In order to compete with each other and stay relevant, both Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza Place continually modified both their video games and the animatronic shows. The 80s were a crazy time for Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater and Showbiz Pizza Place, and things weren't always so pizza-tastic. In 1981, Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater officially went public. Unfortunately, the ever-evolving video game industry, plus a corporate decision to focus funding on side projects like Zapp's Bar and Grill, resulted in huge losses for Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza. To make the situation even worse, the video game industry crash of 1983 happened. As consumers began to turn to the new, exciting world of PC games, consoles, and video arcades, including Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater and Showbiz Pizza Place locations, were hit hard. Total video game sales dropped a staggering 97% across the country, and many arcades were forced to close. This couldn't have been a worse time to have a business model that relied so much on the revenue from arcade games, and as a result, the two companies lost a combined $15 million in 1983 alone. By 1984, the combined debts of Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza seemed utterly impossible to crawl out from under, and as a result, Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater was forced to file Chapter 11 bankruptcy. In 1985, Brock bought out the Chuck E. Cheese franchise and merged Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater and Showbiz Pizza Inc. together to create Showbiz Pizza Time Incorporated. Pretty confusing, right? After this merger, it seemed like all was right with the world of pizza arcades. Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza continued to operate under their respective separate titles, all while some major financial restructuring was going on at the corporate level. In the mid-80s, Creative Engineering, the animatronics company, slowly started to sever their ties with Showbiz Pizza Time altogether, and the former business partners officially parted ways in September of 1990. The 80s were an important time for the Chuck E. Cheese Showbiz Pizza brand in another way. In the early part of the decade, roughly the same time as the video game industry crash and the losses that resulted in bankruptcy, Chuck E. Cheese's went international. The franchise debuted in Australia under the name Charlie Cheese's Pizza Playhouse. This name change had mostly to do with the meaning of the word Chuck, which in Australia means to throw up. Around the same time, Pizza Time Theater Incorporated opened one restaurant in Hong Kong and another in Singapore. However, the Asian locations didn't last long and were both closed as a result of the 1984 bankruptcy case. By the time 1992 rolled around, all Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time restaurant locations assumed the new, shortened name Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza. Eventually, by 1994, the name was shortened even more to simply the Chuck E. Cheese we all know and love today, after further redesigning and concept changes. Do you remember your first visit to Chuck E. Cheese? I totally remember the ticket machine, being somewhat afraid of the animatronics, and wanting to win the giant Chuck E. Cheese doll. Chuck E. Cheese had continued popularity and earned official icon status in the 90s. Showbiz Pizza Time, as it was now known, actually bought out Chuck E. Cheese for a grand total of $35 million, as Showbiz Pizza Time weathered the crash of 1983 a bit better. The student had stumped the teacher, and this acquisition breathed some new life back into Chuck E. Cheese. In the early 90s, Chuck E. Cheese had been rebranded, but some beloved aspects of the franchise stayed the same. Somehow, Chuck E. Cheese, a giant rat, had staying power with the public. People really loved Chuck and his friends. The original show from the 1970s included Krusty the Cat, who was officially retired in 1978 and was replaced with Mr. Munch. Pascali the Singing Chef soon joined the group, followed by Jasper T. Jowls and the Warblettes. In 1979, several of the original locations had added cabaret shows in different rooms of each restaurant. One of these cabaret characters was a hippopotamus named Dolly Dimples, who played the piano and sang in a bluesy jazz style, a la Pearl Bailey and Etta James. Am I the only one who finds it weird that Chuck E. Cheese's, a place for kids, had a cabaret with a hippo that sang the blues? It was the 70s after all. At the beginning of the 90s, utilizing the idea of concept unification, Fechter's characters were removed from Showbiz Pizza locations and were repurposed, redressed, and renamed Munch's Make-Believe Band. By the mid-90s, Chuck E. Cheese himself started undergoing some significant design changes. Chuck's vest and hat were swapped out for a cooler, more modern casual shirt, baseball cap, and sneakers in an attempt to appeal to 90s kids. Let's fast forward a few years to 1998. Chuck went solo and was introduced into new locations, known as Studio C. That same year, the parent company of Chuck E. Cheese's officially dropped the name Showbiz Pizza and rebranded to CEC Entertainment. Studio C consisted of a single, lone animated Chuck, which was created by Garner Holt, surrounded by large television monitors, fun lighting effects, and various other interactive elements. Strangely, though, the other familiar Chuck E. Cheese characters appeared on the TV screens as puppets. The control system that operated the Studio C locations was called Cyberstar and was designed by Dave Phillipson. The very last of these animatronic stage programs was mass-produced in 2012 and was called Circles of Light. The new millennium was dawning, and by the year 2000, there were 300 Chuck E. Cheese locations, and the company was still growing at a steady rate. But, as we know, all good things must come to an end. 2012 was a very important year of transition for Chuck E. Cheese. Even though new locations were still being opened, sales were starting to slump. Always one to change with the times, Chuck was once again rebranded and redesigned as a slim, guitar-playing rock star mouse with a backstory. This time around, according to the company's official website, Charles Entertainment Cheese is an orphan who celebrates other people's and gigantic robotic talking animals' birthdays to make up for his difficult childhood. That's just a little too dark in my opinion. That's not the only change Chuck E. Cheese has made in order to keep up with current trends. Alongside an updated and more woke mascot, Chuck E. Cheese updated the menu to include gluten-free pizza, cold-cut sandwiches, chicken wings, a salad bar, and desserts. Some locations even offer alcoholic beverages for the grown-up who needs to take the edge off. What could possibly go wrong? Despite the efforts at modernization, Chuck E. Cheese just wasn't what it was a couple of decades ago. By 2014, even though sales had started to slump significantly, Chuck E. Cheese still had brand recognition and nostalgia factor, and locations were still being opened overseas. The children of the 80s and 90s were growing up and taking their kids to Chuck E. Cheese. Private equity firms decided to step in and attempt to expand the business in other countries, and reignite Chuck E. Cheese's popularity in the United States. A private equity firm called Apollo Management saw an opportunity in Chuck E. Cheese. In the 2010s, Apollo acquired Chuck E. Cheese in a leveraged and very expensive buyout to the tune of about $1 billion. Under the terms of this buyout, Apollo purchased Chuck E. Cheese with half of their own money and then borrowed the other half. That money then turns into debt, which the company is responsible for paying back in a reasonable amount of time. This buyout was poorly planned and left Chuck E. Cheese with roughly $1 billion in debt. The company already had a lot of debt and expenses, including monthly rent on all properties, pricey arcade game licenses, and don't forget the maintenance on those animatronics. To date, Chuck E. Cheese hasn't actually paid off any of that debt, and they can now add interest payments to their long list of to-dos. Chuck E. Cheese has reported a loss in profits for 5 of the 6 years since Apollo's acquisition. In a sad attempt to rebrand and regain momentum, Chuck E. Cheese has tried whatever it can to revamp its image. These attempts included getting rid of those tired, old, and slightly disturbing animatronics. In 2015, The Chuc-ee Live stage, also known as Stage V2, was created, and included performances by costumed characters as well as an interactive dance floor. The overall look of all Chuck E. Cheese locations was redesigned and reimagined, and the iconic gold game tokens were replaced with a Play Pass card. Even for these changes, things have not been good for Chuck E. Cheese throughout the last decade. In 2017, Chuck E. Cheese announced that the animatronics would finally be removed entirely and for good in favor of the new design. After the success of these updates at some pilot or trial locations, business started to look up for a short time. These updates and new store openings continued through 2019, with 80 locations being retrofitted to the new design, and a reverse merger was discussed, but never happened. As if this weren't bad enough, YouTuber Shane Dawson exposed Chuck E. Cheese circulating old rumors that the restaurant recycled pizza. The company tried to do damage control. Chuck E. Cheese insisted that they didn't recycle or reheat pizza, but the damage was done. Then, in March of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, forcing Chuck E. Cheese to shut down and cease indoor dining. Chuck E. Cheese started selling their pizza, wings, and other menu items through their online food delivery service under the ghost kitchen Pascali's Pizza and Wings. If you remember correctly, the name Pascali comes from the Munch's make-believe band member Pascali P. Pie Plate. Even though the food obviously comes from the Chuck E. Cheese kitchens, Chuck E. Cheese insists that they use different ingredients and recipes that are geared toward a more mature, adult audience. Chuck E. Cheese is still making and delivering food under the Pascali's Pizza and Wings banner. Did you order from Chuck E. Cheese when you were stuck at home during the pandemic, or did you get your pizza elsewhere? Let me know. Chuck E. Cheese has had an extremely difficult time coming back from the pandemic. The loss of revenue from kids' parties and everyday customers has been the final nail in Chuck's coffin. By June of 2020, only half of the 560 locations had reopened for dine-in, delivery, or takeout. Sales declined by an unbelievable 94% in just the first few weeks of the COVID shutdowns, and 21% overall in the first quarter of 2020. To make matters worse, Chuck E. Cheese was forced to lay off 65% of their hourly employees once the stay-at-home orders were issued. By June, Chuck E. Cheese was, once again, forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, claiming almost $2 million in debt. Soon, it was announced that 34 Chuck E. Cheese locations would be closed down for good. Despite all the bad press and closures, Chuck E. Cheese insists that they will be able to recover financially and that they can restore their reputation. If they know what's good for them, Chuck E. Cheese should focus on the nostalgia factor, admit to failure, and stop trying to be so cool. What do you think? Can Chuck E. Cheese feasibly recover from their debt and closures and come back stronger and better? Or is Chuck E. Cheese nothing more than a symbol of a bygone era that we can look back on and say, remember when? I would love to hear what you think. Were you a Chuck E. Cheese kid? What was your favorite arcade game at Chuck E. Cheese? Have you ever taken your kids to a Chuck E. Cheese? Do you think the company can be saved, or should they call it quits? Once again, you're here with Intellectual Digest. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and remember that you can ring the notification bell to get all the latest updates when I post new videos.